Stop the wedding! Let me have him! I'm pregnant! You expected me to break? Look behind you. The billionaire knows everything, and this wedding was your trap.
My sister said those words while walking down the aisle at my wedding, wearing the dress almost identical to mine. 300 guests turned toward me, waiting for the bride to collapse. But I did not look at my fiancé. I looked at the quiet billionaire seated in the last row and gave him the signal we had agreed on. Hello, my name is Claire Bennett. I was 34 years old when my wedding became the most expensive trap ever sat aside a church in Manhattan. To understand why I was smiling, while my younger sister destroyed my wedding, you need to know something about my family. In the Bennett family, appearances were treated like oxygen. My father, Richard, built luxury apartment towers across the East Coast. My mother, Evelyn, built a social life around pretending his money made us respectable. And my sister, Vanessa, spent her entire life believing anything I had was simply waiting for her to take it. When we were children, it was my birthday gifts. In college, it was my friends. Later, it was a job at my father's company that I had spent years earning. Vanessa would smile, cry, and somehow leave the room holding whatever had once belonged to me. My parents always gave me the same advice. Claire, be the mature one. That sentence became the polite family translation for, let Vanessa hurt you, and do not embarrass us by reacting. So I became careful. I studied finance at Columbia, worked 80-hour weeks, and eventually became Chief Operating Officer of Bennett Urban Development. I fixed projects my father had nearly abandoned. I negotiated with banks that no longer trusted him. I learned to read a balance sheet the way other people read facial expressions. Then I met Daniel Mercer. Daniel was charming in a way that felt effortless. He remembered the name of every waiter. He sent flowers to my office for no reason. He told me he admired that I had built an identity beyond my family name. That last part should have warned me. We dated for 2 years. When he proposed on a rooftop overlooking Central Park, I believed I had finally found someone who saw me rather than my inheritance. Vanessa hugged me when I announced the engagement. She held me tightly and whispered, "You finally won something I don't want." She laughed. Everyone laughed, I did not. 6 months before the wedding, small things began to feel wrong. Daniel started taking calls outside. Vanessa knew details about our honeymoon that I had never told her. Once, at a family dinner, Daniel reached for the salt at exactly the same moment Vanessa passed it to him. Their hands froze in the air. It lasted less than a second, but the silence between them felt rehearsed. When I asked Daniel about it later, he kissed my forehead. "You're exhausted, Claire. Your father has you working too hard." It was a perfect answer because it sounded caring while teaching me to distrust myself. Then the first real warning arrived. One Tuesday morning, I received an anonymous envelope at my office. Inside was a photograph of Dangering the Lowell Hotel with Vanessa. The date stamp showed the previous Friday, when Daniel had told me he was in Boston and Vanessa had claimed she was sick at home. On the back, someone had written 5 words. "They are not the whole problem." I stared at that sentence for nearly an hour. Most people would have confronted them. I nearly did. But the photograph had not been sent to my apartment. It had been delivered directly to my locked executive office. Whoever sent it knew where I worked, knew my schedule, and knew the affair was connected to something larger. So I did what I had learned to do in business. I stopped reacting and started auditing. I hired a private investigator named Mara Quinn, a former federal fraud examiner with sharp gray eyes and no patience for wealthy families. I gave her the photograph, Daniel's travel schedule, and access to my personal financial records. 3 days later, she called me from a prepaid phone. "Do not confront anyone," she said. "And do not cancel the wedding." "Why? Because your fiancé is sleeping with your sister? But that is the least dangerous thing he is doing." Mara discovered that Daniel had quietly accumulated debts through failed real estate investments. More than $12 million. He had hidden the loans behind shell companies, and several were due within weeks of our wedding. My marriage would give him access to something far more valuable than my bank account. Under the Bennett family trust, a spouse could serve as an emergency proxy if I became medically incapacitated. With my signature on one additional document, Daniel could also vote my shares in the company. That document appeared in a stack of routine wedding-related legal papers 2 weeks later. He told me it was an insurance authorization. I pretended to believe him. Then Mara found payments from one of Daniel's shell companies to my father's chief financial officer, Martin Cole. She also found emails showing Martin had been moving money out of Bennett Urban Development for years. My father had not built the empire everyone admired, at least not anymore. The company was surviving on hidden loans, false valuations, and money taken from pension accounts belonging to hundreds of employees. Daniel was not merely marrying me for wealth. He and Martin intended to use my voting shares to force a merger, bury the missing money, and sell the company before regulators noticed. Vanessa was part of the plan. According to messages Mara recovered, Daniel had promised to leave me after the merger. Vanessa would receive $5 million and a penthouse in Miami. Their affair was real, but their romance was built on fraud. I thought that was the deepest betrayal. I was wrong. One evening, Mara placed a recording in front of me. My father's voice filled the room. "Claire will sign," he said. "She always does what keeps the family together." My mother's voice answered, calm and cold. "And if she learns about Vanessa?" My father sighed. "Then we remind her to be mature." I did not cry until I reached my apartment. Even then, I gave myself exactly 10 minutes. After that, grief turned into strategy. The billionaire in the last row entered the story the next morning. His name was Julian Cross, founder of Cross Atlantic Capital. Financial magazines called him ruthless. My father called him an enemy. Julian had tried to buy one of our struggling projects, and my father rejected him publicly. What nobody knew was that Julian's younger brother had worked for Bennett Urban Development. His retirement fund was among the accounts Martin had raided. Julian did not want my family's company. He wanted proof. I met him in a private conference room above Grand Central Terminal. He arrived without an entourage, wearing a charcoal suit, and an expression that revealed nothing. "If you came here to protect your inheritance," he said, "we have nothing to discuss. I came here to protect the employees my family stole from." For the first time, he looked directly at me. I gave him copies of Mara's findings. In return, he connected us with federal investigators and agreed to create an emergency fund to keep salaries and pensions intact if the company collapsed. He would finance the rescue, but only if we delivered evidence strong enough to survive my father's lawyers. That was why I did not cancel the wedding. The conspirators still needed my signature. They needed Daniel legally tied to me. They needed the entire board, gathered in one place, for a private vote scheduled immediately after the reception. And we needed them confident enough to reveal everything. So I became the happiest bride in New York. I attended cake tastings with Daniel. I let Vanessa help choose flowers. I smiled while my mother adjusted my veil and told me how lucky I was. Every conversation was recorded under warrants coordinated through the investigators. The closer we came to the wedding, the more careless they became. Daniel placed the proxy document in our prenuptial package. Martin scheduled the emergency board meeting at the hotel. My father arranged for the merger documents to be delivered during the reception. Vanessa ordered a bridal gown from the same designer as mine. That last detail confused me. Then Mara intercepted a message Vanessa sent Daniel. "I won't stay hidden while she gets the photographs. She needs to know I won." Daniel replied after the ceremony, "Not before. We need the marriage legal." Vanessa sent back a single word. "Maybe." I knew my sister. She had never been able to wait for victory. She did not simply want Daniel. She wanted the moment everyone watched me lose him. That gave me an idea. I quietly changed the ceremony schedule. The marriage license would not be signed until after the reception. The officiant was informed. So were the investigators. As far as Daniel knew, the ceremony itself would make us husband and wife. On the morning of my wedding woke beneath a thin silver rain. The ceremony was held at St. Aurelia's, an old stone church filled with white roses, candles, and 300 guests from the worlds of finance, politics, and real estate. My mother entered my dressing room 10 minutes before the ceremony. "You look perfect," she said. Then she locked the door behind her. "Your father needs you to sign one final document." She handed me a folder. It was the voting proxy. "Now, it is only a formality. Daniel can manage things if you are away on your honeymoon." I looked at the woman who had taught me to keep the peace, even when peace required my silence. "Did you know about him and Vanessa?" I had asked. For 1 second, her face changed. Then the mask returned. "Your sister is emotional. Daniel is ambitious. Marriage will settle everyone down. Sign it, Claire. Think of the family." There it was. Not denial, not shock. Permission. I signed the document using the special pen Mara had given me. The ink was visible, but the page itself had been replaced with a law enforcement copy marked and tracked as evidence. My mother exhaled with relief. "I knew you would be mature." When she left, I opened the hidden door connecting the dressing room to a small storage chapel. Mara stood inside with 2 federal agents. "We have her on audio," Mara said. I nodded, but my hands had begun to shake. Mara held them gently. "You can stop now." "We have enough to begin." "No," I said. "We have enough to arrest some of them. I want enough to save everyone they hurt." The organ music began. I walked down the aisle beside my father. Daniel waited at the altar, handsome and composed. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. For one dangerous second, I remembered every morning coffee, every quiet joke, every future I had believed in. Then I remembered the proxy hidden in my mother's purse. The officiant welcomed everyone. Daniel took my hands. He began his vows. "Claire, from the moment I met you." The church doors slammed open. Vanessa stood beneath the archway in a white silk gown nearly identical to mine. Gasps rolled through the church. Phones appeared in raised hands. My mother closed her eyes as if she had been expecting disaster but hoped it would choose another day. Vanessa walked slowly down the aisle, one hand resting over her stomach. She stopped 20 feet from the altar. "Let me have him," she announced. "I'm pregnant." Daniel went completely pale. My father whispered, "What the hell is she doing?" Vanessa looked at me with shining eyes. She expected tears. She expected screaming. More than anything, she expected me to ask why I had not been enough. Instead, I looked toward the last row. Julian Cross was seated beside Mara and two men my father assumed were his attorneys. They were federal agents. I lifted my bouquet and removed one white rose. That was the signal. The church closed behind Vanessa. Security officers moved into place. Julian stood. Daniel released my hands. "Claire, I can explain." "Please do," I said. "The microphones are excellent." A confused laugh moved through the guests. Then the large screen behind the chair came alive. It had been installed for our wedding video. Instead, it displayed bank transfers, shell company records, and copies of the messages between Daniel, Vanessa, Martin, and my parents. Daniel stared at the screen. "What is this?" "Our wedding gift," I said, "to the United States Attorney's Office." Chaos erupted. My father lunged toward the aisle, but one of the agents stepped in front of him. My mother pulled the proxy document from her purse and tried to tear it. Mara calmly took photographs while another agent seized the pieces. Vanessa stood frozen in the center of the church. "You're humiliating me?" she whispered. I almost laughed. "You wore a bridal gown to my wedding and announced you were carrying my fiance's child. You handled the humiliation yourself." Then Daniel did something I had not expected. He pointed at Vanessa. "She planned this. She pursued me. She said Claire would never notice." Vanessa's expression broke. "Told me you loved me. I told you what you wanted to hear?" Their great romance survived less than 30 seconds under pressure. My father shouted for his lawyer. My mother demanded that I stop the presentation. Guests pushed toward the exits, but investigators asked members of the company board to remain as witnesses. Julian walked to the front and handed me a second folder. Inside was the rescue agreement. Cross Atlantic Capital would provide emergency financing, but control would move to an independent board. The stolen pension money would be restored first. My family's personal assets, including the Hamptons estate and private aircraft, would be offered as collateral under a civil settlement, already prepared with regulators. My father looked at Julian as if he had seen a ghost. "You can't take my company." Julian's voice was quiet. "I don't want your company. The employees are taking it back." The board members signed the emergency resolution in the church's side room. Martin Cole was arrested at the reception hotel while trying to leave with a suitcase containing encrypted drives and $200,000 in cash. Daniel was taken into custody before the wedding cake was delivered. My parents were not arrested that day, but their passports were surrendered. Their accounts were frozen, and their mansion became an asset in a federal restitution case. Vanessa was not charged immediately. She had participated in the fraud, but the investigators believed she could help prove Daniel's intent. Faced with prison, she agreed to cooperate. Before she left the church, she approached me in her matching white gown. Mascara had drawn dark lines down her cheeks. "You set me up." "No," I said. "I gave you an aisle, an audience, and a choice. You did the rest." She placed a protective hand over her stomach. "At least I have his baby." Amara glanced at me, but I said nothing. There was one final secret. 2 weeks earlier, Mara had discovered a medical invoice Daniel tried to hide. Years before meeting me, he had undergone a procedure that made it almost impossible for him to father a child. We had confirmed it through records obtained under warrant. I did not reveal that in the church. Revenge did not require cruelty toward an unborn child. The truth belonged in a doctor's office, not on a screen before strangers. 3 days later, Vanessa called me. Her voice was barely audible. "The baby isn't Daniel's." I waited. She told me the father was Eric Sloan, a married investor she had been seeing before Daniel. She had learned about the pregnancy a month earlier and decided Daniel was the safer, wealthier choice. She assumed that once she publicly claimed him, he would protect her to preserve the merger. She had attempted to trap a man who was attempting to trap me. For the first time in her life, Vanessa had stolen something that was never valuable. The months that followed were brutal. Newspapers called it the wedding day fraud case. Videos from the church spread across the internet. Strangers debated whether I was courageous, heartless, brilliant, or insane. I stopped reading the comments. The federal case ended with guilty pleas. Daniel received 11 years in prison for conspiracy, wire fraud, and attempted theft of pension assets. Martin received 14 years. My father avoided prison because of his age and cooperation, but he lost control of the company, most of his fortune, and the reputation he had protected at any cost. My mother moved into a small condominium in Connecticut and told friends she had been betrayed by everyone. Vanessa accepted probation, community service, and a permanent ban from serving as an officer of any public company. Eric's wife filed for divorce. Vanessa raised her daughter largely alone. I did not become chief executive of the rescued company. That surprised everyone. Instead, I helped create an employee-owned trust and served for 1 year as its temporary chair. Every stolen pension account was restored. Hundreds of workers kept their jobs. Then I resigned and opened a financial investigation firm with Mara. We called it Northlight Forensics. Julian became our first investor, but not our owner. I insisted on that distinction. Over time, he also became my friend. Then, much later, something more. There was no dramatic rooftop proposal, no orchestra, and no 300-person audience. Our relationship began with honesty, contracts reviewed by separate lawyers, and enough patience to make romance feel safe again. 2 years after the wedding that never happened, Vanessa asked to meet me. We sat in a quiet park in Brooklyn, while her little girl chased pigeons nearby. Vanessa looked older, but for the first time, she also looked real. No designer armor, no performance. I hated you, she said. Not because you hurt me, because you stopped letting me define you. I appreciated the honesty, but forgiveness is not the same as reunion. I hope you build a good life, I told her. But you will have to build it without taking pieces of mine. She nodded. We did not hug. That evening, Julian and I walked along the East River. The city lights trembled across the water. He asked whether I ever regretted turning my wedding into a trap. I thought of the church, the white dresses, Daniel's face, my father's rage, and the hundreds of employees who had nearly lost everything. I regret that the trap was necessary, I said. I don't regret closing it. For most of my life. My family taught me that maturity meant accepting betrayal quietly. They were wrong. Maturity is seeing the truth without looking away. It is protecting innocent people even when the guilty share your name. And it is understanding that justice does not always arrive wearing a uniform. Sometimes, justice walks down the aisle in a wedding dress, smiles at the people who expected her to break, and says, "Now you may begin."